Hello friends, for today's video we're doing another edition into the A Fantasy Fan Reads video series. If you're new to my channel, the idea behind this video series, I started it last year with the goal of doing a couple of different things. One would be to push myself outside of my comfort zone. As somebody who primarily reads fantasy, doing that means picking up other genres, and whenever I do these videos and they're actually geared toward a different genre, the idea is that I will find a collection of books that oftentimes are recommended to me by all of you, and that way I can kind of have a mix of both the underhyped and the exceptionally popular. It gives me just a little taste of what the mainstream books are from that genre, as well as the underappreciated ones, and I can kind of get a better idea of these genres. Obviously, by no means am I suddenly an expert just because I did one video dedicated to a different genre, but it does allow me to really appreciate and value what stories can be, how different genres are written and navigated, the story beats and how they differ from what I typically read, and just have a better understanding and appreciation for stories in all their different forms and all their different genres. The other side of this is doing deep dives into specific subgenres of fantasy. The very first one of these videos I did was for fantasy romance, which was sort of like a perfect way of combining both the idea of a different genre and a subgenre, as fantasy romance kind of exists on its own now, but it sort of originated from fantasy, so it feels like a subgenre, and I ended up referring to it just as a sister genre. But when I'm doing these deep dives, I want to find books that really represent these various different subgenres and then get to understand what fantasy can be, because we kind of have this idea, myself included, even as somebody who reads a ton of fantasy, we have these ideas of what fantasy is. And even knowing and even saying, oh, fantasy is so far-reaching, it can do so many things, I still feel like I find myself limited to what is popular, or what publishing is pushing, or what the trends are, and I want to push outside of that and remind myself of the wonderful creativity that fantasy has to offer. For today, the specific genre that we're looking at is contemporary romance. And I was actually thinking this would be a kind of fun one, in that one, it's around Valentine's Day. I thought, oh, contemporary romance, I picked that up from here and there, and it's tapping into just so much of what it is to be a person. And because I have some knowledge of this genre, both in the fact that I pick it up from time to time, and also because fantasy romance sort of borrows from and utilizes certain things that are similar to contemporary romance, I thought this would be a fun way to combine some of what I'm familiar with and some of what I have dove into through this video series. I initially was thinking I would read about 3 to 5 books, and I asked for all of your suggestions, and I just always feel bad when I can't get around to things that people suggest to me. So it went from being maybe 3 to 5 to I'm planning to read 7 books for this reading vlog. And I'll, of course, go through what those books are going to be. We'll compare and contrast these different ones. To give you a heads up, the next formal A Fantasy Fan Reads video is going to be for steampunk. I can't wait. I have picked up some of them already, and this is a subgenre that I very much have a feeling that I'm going to be craving constantly from here on out, and I'm just going to want more of, and I'm going to hold other fantasy books to a certain unfair standard as a result, because it's just so cool. But point is, be on the lookout for that if you are more so of a fantasy reader. That will be up eventually. But let's jump into the TBR for the books that we're going to be looking at today. So first up, we have an Abby Jimenez book, because I had seen people talk about this all the time. Some of my friends really like Abby Jimenez, and I'd seen compared to Emily Henry. I've read everything Emily Henry has put out up to the point that I'm filming this, and I was thinking, okay, well, this seems to be kind of compared to Emily Henry as far as how the author navigates the story, the kinds of stories that the author chooses to tell by utilizing certain familiar tropes. So I decided to pick one up, and I picked up Part of Your World, because from what I understand, this is the first in this sort of collection where it is not quite a series. We know from contemporary romance, a lot of times when it's a series, it just means that the first book follows a couple and then the next book follows a different couple, but one of those characters showed up in this first one, that sort of thing. So I did want to go in order. So Part of Your World was one of them. I have read this already. The ones that I'm going to be holding up first are ones that I've either read already or have started. So we also have You Again. This one was recommended by one of you, if I'm remembering correctly. I think you said you don't typically read contemporary romance. I also got a suggestion to read The Brown Sisters by Talia Hibbert. I'd already read those. So I thought, well, I could try picking up something else by Talia Hibbert. So I read The Princess Trap. This one was quite short. And this is the tough part about anything that is romantic in nature, either through a genre or subgenre, is that you almost feel like you need more categorizations for spice levels. And then we also have the one that I have not yet completed, but I've started, which would be the Rom-Commers. This one is on track to be my favorite. I will say, though, I'm biased because the main character is her father's caretaker, and many of you know, before my father passed away, I was his caretaker. He was quite a bit older to have a daughter my age, so I was often helping him out with stuff anyway, and so anytime there's a book where a character is helping a parent or a parental figure in that fashion, it just does immediately make me feel very connected to the character. We'll go far more in depth with these as we progress, but I want to get through the, TBR portion of this. But anyway, the Rom-Commers was one that I believe one of you also recommended to me, and I happened to have had it from Book of the Month, so I was like, okay, yeah. And that was a big thing that determined whether I was able to pick up one of the ones that you recommended or not. Was it in my library? And do I already have, when I say in my library, I mean my library system for like the city I live in. And then also, do I own it because of Book of the Month? Because I do from time to time work with them. This isn't sponsored, by the way, but I do from time to time work with them, so sometimes I have the books that get mentioned. Now for the other ones I haven't had the chance to pick up just yet, we have the Stationery Shop. The way this one was described to me by one of you, I'm like, that sounds really beautiful. And I didn't really look into it too much. I just saw what you said about it, and I was like, okay, that sounds interesting. So that one I have grabbed from my library. We also have One Last Stop. This is it seems like it's going to be a fun story. I don't know too much about it. I've kind of like seen it from other people, and I think it's generally liked, but we'll find out. And then we have The 7-Year Slip. And I believe when this one was recommended, that one of you said there's technically a paranormal element or something with like time. You said, oh, but I'm pretty sure it's still, I don't think you'll mind. I think you'll still consider it part of the contemporary romance genres. So the way that this is going to play out, I'm going to get some clips of my dog Luna Bear, because at this point she is a staple within these videos. You will see her. She's the cutest thing ever. She makes everything better. She is so adorable and I love her so much, and I'm just going to force you all to look at how cute her face is. Anyway, you're going to get clips of Luna, and then we're going to pop back in, talk about some books, potentially get more clips of Luna, and then wrap things up, and I'll do the whole, I'll rank what my ranking would be for the books, my guess for what the rankings would be, then we can all probably be amused at how inaccurate I am about assessing the average ratings, and then we'll kind of call it a day. But that's it for now. Now segueing into my better half, Luna Bear.
Hi, Luna. Good morning.
Luna.
Hi, little one. Hi, Bear. You sleep well, okay? Okay. All right. Good night, little bear. Good night.
I have officially completed all 7 of the books that I picked up for this. I figured I would go ahead and start with the Rom-Commers, as this is the one that I was the most, I think, going into in the first portion of this, in the introduction. So I wanted to give you my final thoughts on this one before moving on to some other things. It started out as probably a strong contender for being up within the top for this reading vlog, but it did go down as I read, unfortunately. I still think there was a lot to like about this one, but the cons for me started to become a little bit more of an irritant, you could say, as I continue to read. I'll highlight the pros first, though. The setup for this one is that you have this young individual who has been somebody who has been very passionate about movies for a long time, and they love to write, and they are extremely skilled at this. However, after tragedy struck within the family, which I don't want to say too much about because that is something that you discover as you read more, their life ended up being flipped upside down, and they are now their father's caretaker. As somebody who also was my father's caretaker, I really connected with the with the character on this, where you just sort of have to put everything on hold. And it also does, and I think that the book addresses this very well, it does affect you financially a lot as well. And it does affect your social life. It kind of really highlights who is in your life in a way that is meaningful and who is just sort of somebody that's a passerby, we'll say. And I think it addressed all of those things in a very realistic manner. But the financial angle of all of this and the way that your passions get put off to the side, I think that the love interest, when he first is introduced and he first meets her, he is somebody that essentially puts the blame on her. He doesn't know her full story, but he has his assumptions about, well, you clearly don't care enough about your dreams. If you really want to be taken seriously in Hollywood, you need to be willing to put in the work. And he has all of these thoughts that are horrible, and that because he's an arrogant jerk, basically, he feels very comfortable just saying these things, despite the fact that he doesn't really know her at all. And I think that even though that left room for growth with him, and even though it made him very unlikable to start, he sort of represented in a lot of ways how society can view people by just getting a glance at them without actually knowing the full story. So I appreciated the inclusion of that, even though it wasn't easy to read. And the main character, she gets to a point where she doesn't even feel like explaining herself. She essentially just lets people believe whatever they're going to believe, because what's the point? She's so exhausted anyway, and she's already doing so much in general to care for others that there is this sort of neglect for herself. She doesn't really care about herself, but she does get lost in the love of stories, especially the love of love stories. It kind of keeps her going. And I really loved all those things about this work, which is why when I was first starting it, I was like, I think this is going to be, as I said, a pretty strong contender. Her dad also is so cute. He is the cutest person. So I really, really loved her father in this. I loved him so much. The main character and the way in which her life becomes intertwined with the love interest's life is that he is somebody who is also known for working in the industry, and he's very successful, and she looks up to him so much. And she has the opportunity to work on a rom-com with him, but it turns out that the way in which they're put in each other's atmospheres is not at all what they were expecting, and so it makes them start off on the wrong foot. He's very irritable. She kind of puts up with it a lot because she admires his work, and she definitely makes a lot of excuses for him. Part of her growth in the story, I think, is recognizing how she deserves to be treated, what she wants for herself, and also just how to find the means to live her life for her, despite the fact that she's had to give up so much. I think that in some ways was motivated by the fact that she was starting to very, very quietly and slowly push back until she finally started to stand up for herself. And then for him, he is so accustomed to everybody treating him a certain way because he is just a means to an end. And so he doesn't really have a lot of skill when it comes to being personable or being kind. And he also has so much privilege at this point that there really is no reason for him to even try to do some self-reflection and work. So they definitely grow off of each other for sure. I found him irritating, and I kept waiting for him to be somebody who started to grow a little bit more. But I did feel like a lot of the story was him just being a little childish. And so it made it harder for me to root for them together because it felt as though she had to sort of be the adult in the equation. I don't really love relationships in stories or in real life where it feels like one of the characters is the adult and the other one is not. That's not my favorite type of romance. I don't think it was done poorly. I do think that these characters grew as individuals and they grew together in a lot of ways. But I did feel like some of the third act breakup stuff was a little forced, and it almost felt emotionally manipulative. And if you end up reading it, I think you'll see why, because it's kind of beyond just a misunderstanding. It's not even really a misunderstanding between the characters. It's sort of like a misunderstanding between the love interest and his doctor, we'll say. There were little things that would pop up throughout that did frustrate me. And the main character, despite the fact that I do think she grows in an organic and in a good way, I still found that some of her ways of sort of extravagantly flailing were a little much for me. You can probably guess that by the word choice I just used. I mean, she just literally goes off the deep end You'll know what I mean if you've picked it up. And I think I have a hard time when people end up behaving in ways that feel almost unrealistic in order to show that they're struggling. It feels a little too exaggerated. However, as I said, there's a lot of pros to that one, so I'm not upset that I read it. I really appreciated a lot of the aspects of it that had to do with the main character and her father. I do feel like her personal growth was done for the most part quite well. I just didn't necessarily love it from a romance angle, and I found the love interest a little irksome. So it's kind of more in the middle. Unfortunately, this next one, if you're the individual that recommended this to me, I'm glad this one worked out for you. It didn't really end up working out for me, so if you're watching this, can completely understand. If you're like, I don't want to hear any negativity towards this one, feel free to skip ahead. But this one did not quite work for me, and this is probably my least favorite that I picked up, which would be You Again. This story is following a blueprint based off of a rom-com that exists, and the idea is that these two individuals, they keep running into each other at different points in their lives, and initially all of the first interactions that they end up having are very negative. They do not get along whatsoever, they butt heads, they basically hate each other. And then when they finally meet and then have the opportunity for it to be more than just a brief interaction, they can actually sort of have some kind of friendship, they are really at their lowest points in life. But they've seen glimpses of each other at their highs and also their beginnings. And so now that they've kind of crashed and burned, they're sort of this mutual, well, doesn't life suck? And they're just sort of bummed out together. And that's sort of what brings them to each other. Through that, they're realizing they have feelings for each other, but they also both have such pasts with relationships and with success and with themselves that it's very hard for them to not have those things get in the way of their feelings for each other. The pro, I would say, with that story is that it wasn't afraid to show them at their worst, and it was somewhat built upon that very idea. And I think that is very realistic and very relatable. So many of us have reached certain heights in our careers or in relationships, and we think life is going one way, and then everything is pulled out from under us, and we feel like we have to start over. I really appreciated the inclusion of that. I think that's going to be very meaningful to a lot of people. It's especially meaningful when you see characters persevere through those low times. That can be very uplifting. What I think frustrated me with this one is they are both incredibly unlikable people, and I really didn't like them at all when I first started, but I thought, okay, obviously the whole point is you get these snapshots of them in their youth, I'll say, and then once they've reached a certain point in their adulthood, that is where we're going to be moving forward. So we're going to see them have their blunders early on, and we're going to see them have growth, and sure, it'll be fast forward, perhaps because of the nature of how we're getting these snapshots. I'm okay with that. So then we're going to see them at their low points, and then they're going to grow. I believed that would happen. It did happen. However, the majority of the book is them being kind of awful. And then at the very end, you see them kind of working on themselves, getting their lives together. And of course, it's a romance. The idea is they're going to find a way to be together. And I appreciated that we spent time with the characters truly, truly working on themselves before we got this, well, you know what? Perhaps the idea is that because we were miserable together, then we can be happy together. And that wasn't necessarily the takeaway, because part of why they're miserable is because of the work that they need to do. So I appreciate that we did have them do the work individually, but it was such a small percentage of the book that I'm like, I don't really feel like they grew that much necessarily. And they make some pretty big, they do some pretty interesting things when they're not doing well. I also just a little bit found that the female lead in the story, it was like all of her dialogue and all of her hobbies, it felt like I spent more time hearing about her going to sex shops than I did about her career, which was seeming okay, since so much of her feeling very down in the story is because her career is that she loves to do stand-up comedy. And she's kind of the New Yorker who's going to these various different places and trying to do stand-up and just getting by, and they're barely making anything, but they love it. So they're fine with the hustle and they'll do whatever random side jobs and they don't mind having these quick little relationships and whatever. And this is their dream and they're going to go for it, but they're struggling. And then at some point they go through something very traumatic in their life and for some reason they just can't bring themselves to get on stage anymore. I say for some reason because they discuss that in the book. I don't want to reveal. But it's very difficult for them to kind of follow their dreams again because it's like, well, the last time I took a chance on something big, it crashed and burned, so I don't want to take a chance anymore. I would rather just sort of sit in these jobs where I'm like cleaning up after people and I'm doing service jobs and I'm working in the service industry over and over and over again at these different pop-up places and whatever, it's fine. I just got to make ends meet and I'll hook up with these people on these dating apps because life is meaningless anyway and so are relationships and also I'm just... So they just don't quite know what direction to go in and so you don't see them going on stage anymore. So I recognize why you see them sort of have this block where they don't even want to address the fact that they're not pursuing their dreams anymore. But I still feel like it's such an integral part of their character development is the getting back on stage. And the craft of writing for comedians is a huge deal, and going and watching other people's work is a huge deal. And I just wish we'd heard a little bit more about that because so much of her character was about, I love to have sex, and that's great that she does, but it almost felt like a way, and this is where I think what I'm actually trying to zero in on, is it felt like a way, because she was so open about these things, and the male love interest is this kind of like moody, edgy guy who's quiet and reserved and grumpy all the time. And it felt like her being the phrase manic pixie dream girl, she's very much that, but like super sexually charged. It felt like those aspects of her were so that we could get him to break a little bit and he notices, like he can't help but notice that does sound pleasant and now he's thinking of her in that way. It felt like that's more of the reason why those things happen so frequently, and it resulted in not feeling particularly realistic or organic necessarily. It ended up resulting in her feeling like a little bit of a caricature. So in a way, it was almost like a plot convenience to push their awakening of their feelings for each other, as opposed to people sometimes just, maybe they say something here and there and maybe that catches the other person's attention, but they do connect about real stuff for sure. I don't want to try and imply that there's no conversations that happen of meaning between the two of them, but I just wanted a little bit more from her, I suppose, and I think I wanted more from both of these characters. As I said, the growth portion of the story is such a tiny portion, and so it felt like fast forward so that we could still have them get together in the end. Moving on now, next up we have One Last Stop, and this book had a component to it that made it not entirely just real life, and the setup is that you follow this young girl who is very much sort of weighed down by something that happened in her mother's past, and her mother has sort of forced her to be a part of this situation for a lot of her life, and she's trying her best to live her own life. She's young, she gets an apartment with her friends, or I should say she makes friends with these people. She has a hard time making friends in general. She's just trying to do what she can to start her life. She's studying, she's not always sure what she wants to do, but she's kind of just stuck in that place that I think a lot of people at that age are in, or a lot of times in our lives. So she's kind of just in this limbo. And speaking of being in limbo, she ends up riding this train and she meets this woman who she is instantly very caught off guard by, because the woman is just so charismatic, she's beautiful, she's attractive, and she has this general air about her that our main character finds very attractive in general. And so she's hoping like, well, I know it's New York City, so what are the chances I'm ever going to run into her again? And she does end up running into her again, and they start striking up conversations, and they seem like they're getting along great, but then anytime she asks her like, oh, would you want to maybe come to my work sometime? Maybe I can get you some free breakfast or something like that, because she works at this little diner. And the character's like, oh yeah, that sounds great. And then she doesn't show up. So she thinks, oh, I guess she's not really interested in me. And then she sees her again on the train and thinks, okay, well, this conversation's going really well. And once again, I'm getting these signals that she's maybe into me, but I can't tell, because anytime I try to ask her if she wants to maybe come out with me. She doesn't seem like she does. Then it starts to dawn on her that she always sees her on the same train at the same time every day, pretty much. And at some point, they finally realize, oh my gosh, she's stuck on this train. And she thinks at first, like, maybe she's a vampire. Like, she doesn't know what to think. And she's not really sure how this works, but it seems that somehow this woman has been stuck on this train for decades. And it doesn't always appear that she has an awareness that she's stuck. And she also perhaps doesn't even have awareness really at all, but something about our main character has kind of sparked this ability to start to retain information. And now her and her friends are trying to do what they can to help this woman not be stuck on the train anymore, basically. And through this, you're getting to know more about her. And my favorite parts about the book were just seeing what a resilient, defiant spirit that our love interest was, because she was somebody who was a lesbian at a time when a lot of people had horrible views. They didn't really have the same rights. They were mistreated. And so she was really fighting back against that. She didn't really always understand herself, which put her in some ways, even though she loved her family, it made her feel like her and her family were just always not quite on the same wavelength. And she had to discover things about herself, but then felt like, I don't know how I can share this part of myself with my family. And so she just kind of bounced along from place to place, living life. And I really enjoyed those aspects of the story. I liked both of the main characters quite a bit in this, but I also was like, she's stuck on a train. I don't know. I'm very picky about contemporary stories that do utilize some kind of thing like this. I understand that there was a lot of tragedy in the coming to terms with the fact that everything she ever knew is gone now. And if she does manage to get off this train, is she going to go back to that time, or is she going to be in present day? And which would be the better option anyway? Because if she's in present day, has everybody she loved died? And if she doesn't know how the world works anymore, but if she goes back, then this woman that is our main character that she's been falling in love with, well, that goes out the window. She doesn't get to be with her anymore. So there's a lot of sacrifice and tragedy with the very nature of the setup of this story. And also, I do feel like it was a good vehicle for reflecting on where rights for people have started and where they are now. And there is that little glimmer of hope too, where the character's like, I promise that if you and I were to walk off this train together in New York City, that people wouldn't necessarily treat us the way they would have treated you when you were young. And so there's a lot of those kinds of things that I thought made sense to the idea of having part of the past and the present collide. I was starting to say before that I can be relatively picky when it comes to some kind of speculative element being woven into what is otherwise just real life. I know that is my own personal thing. That is not a fault of the books or any kind of objective flaw. But I think it's just the fantasy fan in me and being kind of critical of magic systems and plot convenience and things like that, where I understand that it was a vehicle for looking at the past and the present and finding this love story in the middle of all of those things. And while I appreciate that and I think it executed it well, it is hard for me to get out of the whole, like, but how does it work exactly, though? What about all these other people that perhaps are stuck in some kind of... And I just start spiraling into those sorts of things, and it's, again, not the book's fault whatsoever. But I do think I would really love to see this author write a story that just takes place in a different time, and it's just settled in that time, because I think really you can get into some gritty areas of all of the hardships that were faced. And I actually kind of wonder, I do want to be very clear, by no means am I saying that genres are held to such a restrictive box that they can't do a lot of work when it comes to showcasing a lot of heavier topics. They absolutely can. It's just there are certain things that we tend to want from certain genres, or that we expect from certain genres. And I think that what my favorite parts of this were perhaps would be really well done in a story that's just considered fiction, because within a romance story, that does tend to be the focus of it. It's kind of what's uniting all of the pieces. And we also, from my understanding anyway, is in order for something to be considered a romance, there has to be a happy ending. And so I'm not saying that, like, I would have preferred this if it was sad or anything like that, But I so loved and appreciated the parts that were focusing in on all of what the love interest had to endure and what they persevered through and how they found companionship through all of those things. I really think it would be great to see this author really settle in on that and focus on that. And perhaps while they can still, of course, write love stories, and maybe they can even write a contemporary story where all those other things are taking place, I still think that I would like to see that, seeing as those were my favorite parts of this book. Not that the love story was bad. It was very cute, certainly, but I really liked those parts. Those were the most moving parts to me. Because One Last Stop had an element to it that is typically seen as outside of the realm of possibility, I'll go ahead now and stick with that and talk about the 7-year slip. The idea behind this story is that you have a character who ends up going into this apartment, and when they go into this apartment, just within the apartment itself, they are suddenly in the past. And when they're in the past, they are talking to and are able to communicate with somebody who also is currently living their life 7 years in the past, except for when they leave the apartment, they're still 7 years in the past. Our main character, if she leaves the apartment, she is back in present day. And it is through some shenanigans, we'll say, that she ends up sharing this apartment with the person that is 7 years in the past, and that turns out to be the love interest in the story. And then there's this element of, okay, well, obviously at some point, I'm no longer going to be able to see them. There is some magical powers with the apartment where at some point it's going to cut you from being able to go into the past, and so whoever that person was that you were interacting with, if you want to find them, you're going to have to find them in present day, which means you're not going to have seen them for them in 7 years. You'll have just seen them yourself because you were able to go into the past. But once you're officially cut off from that person, you are now, if you ever find them again, not going to have been a part of their life for 7 years. Hence the title, The 7-Year Slip. I was nervous, I will say, because of the fact that I can be relatively picky. But I think what ended up sort of kind of working with this particular element of the story is that our main character already knew this about the apartment. You don't gather that initially, but once the magical things start happening, you realize, like, oh, she'd been told that this could happen before, and she expects it to some degree. She has an idea of what's happening once it does occur. She's just not actually experienced it firsthand herself, but she'd heard about it because this is her aunt's old apartment. Her aunt had told her about this apartment and its magical abilities and how this sort of scenario had happened to her. So now our main character, when it starts happening to her, because she now is living in this apartment, she's like, I know what this is. And in a way that almost worked for me. More than as an example, I did a similar style video for holiday romances, and one of the holiday romances I read was a character who kept reliving the same events over and over again until she quote-unquote like got it right and started living for herself and things like that. And that one I think was harder for me to buy into because the character in that story, there's a part where she even thinks, if the love interest doesn't believe me, I don't know if this is going to work. And I'm like, I mean, it's a pretty tall tale, you know? It's a pretty hard thing to believe. I don't know if I think that you should hold them to that. It's so outside the norm, right? Whereas in this story, our main character was like, oh yeah, I know this is a thing. So you're like, okay. I guess, again, it's the fantasy person in me being like, okay, it's already kind of established. And then later on, there isn't that scenario of like, if he never believes me, then I don't know what I'm ever going to do. It's like, there's not necessarily that expectation placed. I think the One Last Stop, it kind of also worked a little bit more, despite the fact that I am still picky about those sorts of things. Not picky like, I don't think they did it well, but more so, it's just hard for me to get over. But One Last Stop, there is sort of this, everybody ends up being like, okay, well, this is the situation, and now we got to try to help this person be free from this time trap they're stuck in. So anyway, back to the 7-year slip. I felt like the love story was not the best part of this book. The best part of this book was the reflection on grief, and just be mindful before you go in. I'm going to put a little timestamp for a second here because the thing I'm going to say is sort of a reveal in the story, but I think it's important to mention that this exists within it. For some people, this is going to be something that they're going to want to know ahead of time. But if you don't want to know anything ahead of time, then you can go ahead and skip. It's just going to take just a moment. But the main character had a very close relationship with her aunt, and it's established at the beginning of the story that her aunt has passed away and she's really struggling with this. And at some point it is revealed in the story that her aunt ended up taking her own life. So I wanted to make that known to anybody that might know for themselves that's going to be a really difficult thing for me to pick up, or maybe at a certain time in your life you'll feel like you are able to pick it up, but maybe right now is not a good time. I wanted to at least give that heads up. The grief aspects of this book I thought were exceptional. Reading the author's note at the end of the book was really, I'm getting choked up thinking about it, because I was like, when I was actually listening to this one because I don't have a physical copy of it. So when I was listening to the author's note at the end, my husband was near me and I was like, don't start crying, because he's gonna be like, are you okay? And it's got such a vibrant, cute cover and everything too that I think that would have been confusing, not once I explained, but the grief elements are really fantastically done, and I think it added an extreme level of meaning to this book. When it comes to, oh, my air conditioning just turned on. I'm gonna have to turn that off because it's really noisy. Hold on, my air conditioning, I turned it off, so back to business as usual. So when it comes to fulfilling the expectations and sort of fulfilling the promises by the very nature of this being considered a contemporary romance, it does those things, but because I didn't really feel like that was the strongest part of the book, and I wasn't that invested in the main character and her relationship with the love interest, as a result of that, I think this one, it doesn't really succeed as strongly on the contemporary romance blueprint, but I do think that the grief elements were so powerful and so exceptionally done that I would definitely recommend this book. Just know that perhaps if you're in the mood genuinely for a cute, oh my gosh, will they, won't they, of course they will, but also like, how are they going to get there? And I just can't wait to see how they fall in love. If you're looking for that, I don't know anybody that's how they think of it, but if you're looking for something like that, this perhaps is not the one to pick up. This is one to pick up where there's almost like a backdrop of a love story, and it does take up a lot of the page time, but I do feel like it's those other elements that are really what made this book shine a little bit more. Now, I think that this is a good segue into the book that of all the ones today perhaps fulfills the checklist, I'll call it, the best, without just feeling like a checklist. It feels like it's fulfilling the promises and it is checking a lot of the boxes, but it's doing so in a way that still feels like it has meaning, and that would be Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. I definitely think that this is popular for the very reason that I just described. It fulfills those promises exceptionally. The idea of what a lot of us have when we think contemporary romance, or I suppose just speak for myself, the idea I have, that's this book. And I look forward to checking out more Abby Jimenez, as I think likely that's going to be true of her other works as well. But it's not just that, oh yeah, it's going to have the third act breakup, and it's going to have the happily ever after, and it's going to have the relatable main character. It's not just that it has those things. There are heavier things that are talked about. There are real life things that a lot of people can connect with and really relate to. So for example, our main character is somebody who is going through a very difficult breakup, and within that difficult breakup, their partner has harmed them in some fashion. They've hurt them, not physically, but they have done some things that are not okay. It's not an okay way to treat somebody, but her family is so enamored with this individual, and he is seen as so successful. She also works with him, which is very challenging, that he has a lot of motivation to try and convince her that she just needs to do what she can to make the situation work, even though he's the one that basically ruined the relationship. And to have her whole family basically on his side, despite the fact that he did something very hurtful, is very challenging for her. And so she's just trying to figure out how she can live her life for herself. He is making things very difficult, and he is not allowing her to have a clean break whatsoever. So she is just doing everything she can with that. We also see through one of the side characters that abusive relationships are explored that are physical in nature. And so it really is looking at how difficult it is, even when you have a support system, that it's so challenging to escape those scenarios. So there are some heavier things addressed. I think one of the core aspects of the story, at least for the main character is the idea of being within an enmeshed family, when everybody has decided what you're going to do because the rest of the family says so, and these are the expectations that are placed on you, and these are the things that we expect you to do. And when that's tied to outside circumstances that almost seem to fulfill these thoughts. So for example, our main character, she works at this hospital, and it's almost like a legacy family within this hospital, and just her very presence there brings a lot of money in to this particular place. And so if she wants to do anything for herself, if she wants to explore a different job, then there's a chance that it's going to literally mean less money for the hospital because their name carries a lot when it comes to donors. And she doesn't feel like that's an okay thing to do. She's like, I don't want to leave this area. I don't want to move. I don't want to move for the person that I'm falling in love with because there are serious repercussions to me no longer working here, and I don't think it's fair for all of these patients and for this hospital to face these negative things as a result of me doing what I want for my life. But that's a very unfair position for one individual to be placed in, and so there are reasons that I think a lot of people can look at our main character's situation, and even if it's not exactly relatable to them, there are things that you're like, okay, I understand why the character is feeling the way they do, and it does result in the sort of third act breakup aspect of the story making sense. The main character's love interest is so likable. They feel like a real person too, but he's an exceptionally likable character. I think they have fantastic chemistry when it comes to how the main characters come together and how they fit with each other and their chemistry. I definitely think that this couple was probably my favorite of all of the ones on this list. I liked them both as individuals. The love interest, though, for me in this one, I liked him more than I liked the main character, and he was one of my favorite characters of all of the characters that we explored in all of these books. So I do feel like this one, if you're genuinely like, I want to check out a contemporary romance book where, yes, there's some harder hitting stuff and there's some relatable stuff, but I just, at the end of the day, I want to see two likable characters fall in love and figure out ways to find the time for each other through all of the other things going on in life. If that's what you're looking for, I feel like that book definitely meets that very well. The Princess Trap. This one was the most probably explicit, and I would say it's more driven by the characters being physically intimate with one another as opposed to them falling in love with each other through all the things that life throws at them, like what I was just describing with Part of Your World. And that is not the kind of story that I'm looking for. I do think, though, that this author, Talia Hibbert, just really has such a cheeky, fun way of writing, and I do feel like some of the dialogue some of the throwaway lines are very entertaining and very funny. So the setup for the story is that you follow this young woman who is instantly attracted to this man that enters the scene, and he instantly is attracted to her, and they just immediately hit it off. But it turns out that this man is actually royalty in this other country, and he doesn't want her to be caught up in his scandals. So he's like, well, I think what will help and go a long way is if the paparazzi believe that you are my fiance rather than just some kind of fling. I think that will provide you some level of protection. And she's like, that's a crazy idea. And he's like, but, you could pretend to be my fiance. I'll pay you a lot of money if you go along with that. And she's like, well, and there are some real life things. I do want to make sure this is noted. There are some aspects to the fact that she is motivated through the idea of getting money, not because she's a selfish person, but because when you are somebody who is not of great wealth the way that he is, money is a huge part of what you have to try and attain, because her sister is somebody that has something that she needs a lot of money for when it comes to her medical expenses. She's a brilliant young mind and the family wants to support her, but they're all really financially struggling. And our main character does not feel like it's fair to her sister and her parents to have to deal with these things on their own. And she's always wanted to help where she could. So she figures, okay, sure, I'll accept this offer, but also you need to recognize, you being the love interest, you need to recognize that you still hold the power, even if I'm getting paid through all this, because of the fact that you have so much privilege and you can't even fathom that this is a decision I would make because you've never had to worry about money. Like, there's commentary on that kind of stuff, so I appreciate the inclusion of that. And also within his character arc, you're looking at some conversations about abuse, specifically abuse at children, and how that has shaped him, how it has affected his romantic relationships, and how he chooses to be physically intimate with other people. So there are things, I do want to be clear, there are other things within this, but I would say the driving motivation is them hooking up with each other, which they do a number of times and in very explicit ways. And that is not necessarily always what I'm looking for in my stories. I really would like all those other things that our author was including within the book. I would like those things really elaborated on, maybe cutting back a little bit on that other stuff. I don't think that it was without intention, because of the way that for him specifically, you're seeing how his physical intimacy is so tied to his past, and how he allows himself to be vulnerable, and his way of being vulnerable is to actually be the aggressor in those scenarios, so long as the individual, which would be our main character, is consenting to that. So there are reasons, I think, for why it's written the way it is. It didn't really work for me, but I think that it's going to work certainly for a lot of people, especially because this author has such a great authorial voice. The last one for today was my absolute favorite, not just of this reading vlog, but this is now one of probably my new favorite books. I thought it was phenomenal. I thought it was so incredibly heartbreaking, tragic, but also hopeful, and there were so many poignant things woven into the story, and that would be The Stationery Shop. I saved this one for the end of as far as this portion where I'm going through my thoughts on all of them, because while it was my favorite, I don't know if this is considered a romance, and I don't almost think it's fair to compare it to the other books. And I also feel bad because I loved it so much that it kind of comes across, and I really want to be clear that this isn't what I intend, it almost comes across like I liked it the most because it wasn't contemporary romance, or at least what I think of when I think contemporary romance, and I don't want to give that impression whatsoever. I just don't know if the romance itself was the driving factor. I also don't know if you can call the ending... I don't know if you can call the ending a happily ever after, which I know is a pretty significant piece of criteria for a lot of readers. It was kind of just this historical fiction story where, yes, there is a love story within this, but it's a very tragic love story. And there's so much within this story that is explored beyond just the love story. And I think a lot of aspects of it are given a lot of time. So there's certainly within the historical fiction portion of things, while it is somewhat a backdrop, you are looking at 1950s Iran, and you're looking at this time when it seemed like there's all these different political groups and different people are advocating for different things, and it just seems like they're on the brink of something, and what that something is, nobody at the time really knows. And our main character is this young girl who's just finishing high school in this time where it feels like the whole world could change, but she's just sort of a young girl who it's like, well, I mean, my father would really love if I got an education, and he's so excited at the idea that his daughters can get an education and we can be something. So I want to be something, but I don't know exactly what I want to be, and I don't know if I want to be the thing my father wants me to be. And so she's just kind of this young woman that is right about to start her life, and she meets this young activist who really wishes for a lot of people to have more rights, and he wants to ensure that that is going to be their future. And these two end up falling in love. When I say that it doesn't necessarily feel like the focus, while it is something that ties a lot of the events of the story together, at times these characters aren't even with each other for entire parts of the book. And also, you don't really get sort of that in-depth examination of all of the little ways that they think about each other and the way their hands brush. And so it's more kind of, in a sense, it's almost like we're just sort of getting snapshots of them falling in love. So you do see them fall in love. And from there, you then are looking at the present day where our main character, this isn't a spoiler, this is how the book opens. You're looking at present day where she is a very elderly woman at this point. She is about to be reunited with this young man that she fell in love with back in Iran. She's now in America, and she has lived a whole life separate from him, and you are kind of figuring out the pieces of what pulled them apart and what happened within that time that a lot of the book takes place in and present day. So that's a lot of what's being explored in the story. I thought so much of it was so exceptionally well done. the ways that human behavior manifests as a result of trauma and of things that have happened in our past, and the way that sometimes you can just kind of become numb to life. I also think there's a lot of really, really fantastically done aspects of being an immigrant in the story, of how you try to connect to people through your culture. You want to share your culture with other people. You want to understand their culture, but when yours is the one that is less known, and you could even say less accepted, it just feels like you always have to become kind of quieter than whatever the more common culture is within the area you're living within. And there's some very heartbreaking things related to that, and our main character sort of connecting to cooking as a way to remind her of home and her family, trying to make the best of her life, going through some genuinely really tragic things. I'm once again going to do what I did for the 7-year slip, which is just to give a heads up about something that's in the book that you might want to know about. But if you don't want spoilers of any kind, even though I'm not going to give the specifics, I'm just going to mention that this happened within the story. But I don't want to, I just don't want people going in without knowing this. So just that timestamp is there if you want to skip ahead. But there are multiple instances in the story of discussions about the loss of a child, and those times of the book were very, very, very difficult to read. So now kind of bouncing off of that, you're also seeing a lot of conversations about generational trauma. So much of what sort of pulled the characters apart is rooted in what has happened actually in the past, but it didn't feel like this sort of plot convenience kind of Deus Ex Machina thing by any means. It more so was just like, yes, family members, how they live and how they think of you and your place within their lives is going to affect your life. And all of that was done exceptionally. I thought this book was fantastic. I thought the writing was great. The way that different random characters would be given almost, you could say, their own perspectives from one part to the next, and then how all of those things kind of came together and were explained. All of it was, I thought, just this puzzle that came together to create this very beautiful but very tragic story. As I said, don't know that I can even consider it a contemporary romance, and maybe some of you in the comments can educate me a little bit on if you feel like it fits the criteria. Obviously, one of you was one of the people that made me aware of this book and you recommended it to me. So, I mean, you obviously thought it fit within this umbrella, but I just don't know, because this isn't a genre I'm as familiar with. So please feel free to elaborate on this point a little bit more. I thought that book was amazing, though. I had checked it out from the library, so I very much planned to get a copy of it, and I had noted a few things, because even though I checked it out from the library, I also listened to the audiobook, and I made some audiobook bookmarks of passages that I'm like, oh man, I want to tab this because this was so beautifully written, or I feel like the way that this is captured was exceptional. And so I would want to reread this book in general. I'm definitely going to try to have my husband read it because I think he would think it was fantastic too. It was a very, very beautiful but sad story that I highly recommend to basically everybody. Rather than go through my ranking of the books as this was the top, this was the bottom, and then everything in between, I'm more so going to go about this as somewhat of an informal tier ranking. The only thing that I would put at the absolute top would be the Stationery Shop, just because this one was absolutely outstanding when it comes to the things that I really appreciate seeing in books. I thought that this was firing on pretty much all cylinders. I thought it was really fantastic. For what would be the second tier, I would say Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. And I think that the 7-year slip as well. This one, to me, if I were to say which one truly was the winner as far as if there's a given prompt, which one fit the prompt the best, you could almost say, then I definitely think Part of Your World wins, even though the Stationery Shop for me wins as far as which book actually was my favorite. So this one would be in that second tier. And then for the 7-year slip, I just felt like the elements on grief were so exceptional and were so powerful that it didn't feel right to put it any lower than second tier, even though I would say I wasn't particularly invested in the actual love story of that one. I think just below that, we have One Last Stop and the Rom-Commers. Similar to what I was saying about the 7-year slip, I didn't actually end up caring about the love story in this one that much. I wouldn't say I was actively rooting against them. I just didn't really care about them. With the 7-year slip, I thought they were cute. It was just kind of like a in fast forward sort of love story, whereas in this one, you got more time with them. I just didn't really care about them as a couple that much. But the elements on being a caretaker and also just how adorable her father was in this definitely bumped it up for me. One last stop, as I articulated in the portion where I was going through my thoughts, I just feel like the powerful components of being resilient in a time when you are fighting for not just yourself, but future generations as well. I really thought that that part was really, really well done. I did like the couple in this one. Like I said, in this one, I didn't really care that much about the couple. I liked the couple in this one. I just don't know if I felt like the love story itself was the thing that I was continuing to turn the page for. And then the two that didn't really work for me, as I already stated, I feel like with the princess trap, it's not that I feel that the book didn't do a good job of what it was trying to be. It's just what it's trying to be isn't necessarily for me. And then with You Again, I just really didn't like these two characters. I didn't like them as a couple, and I didn't like them as individuals that much. I feel quite bad, and I do wish we had seen more work that they were putting in to themselves, because that was sort of something that just kind of was a little bit there at the end. Now I'm gonna guess what I think the Goodreads average ratings would place these at. I'm gonna guess that I think the Stationery Shop might also be really at the top. I know it's probably me being hopeful, but I genuinely think it's a really, really beautifully done book, and the writing is great, so I think it would be up high. The reason I'm struggling here, though, is because I do feel like different genres have different average ratings. So, for example, I actually feel like a lot of people are harder on young adult books than adult fantasy books. So if you look at young adult fantasy, I think sometimes the average rating of all young adult fantasy can be a little bit lower. But then adult fantasy, I think, can actually lean a little bit higher. And I think romantasy or fantasy romance can be even higher. So with the Stationery Shop versus contemporary, I'm like, do I think that part of your world has a higher average rating because are people nicer to contemporary romance books than they are to, because I think the Stationery Shop would just be considered literary fiction, or just fiction, or historical fiction, depends on how you look at it. But I'm like, oh, I don't know. But I'm gonna go with the Stationery Shop. I think is probably on top, and then I'm gonna say this Abby Jimenez book is gonna be second. I could see these being swapped, and then from there, I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. I kind of feel like this might be one of those rare times where I think my feelings might maybe be somewhat reflected by the general public as well. I mean, I am part of the general public, but I think you know what I'm saying. So I'm going to say Stationery Shop number 1. I'm going to say Part of Your World 2. 3, I'm going to say... I might put One Last Stop, because as far as love stories go, I feel like people would be more likely to be rooting for this couple. Maybe... And I think people are going to appreciate the components of it that maybe I appreciated as well. Then I'm going to say the 7-Year Slip. And then the Rom-Commers. Then I'm going to say the Princess Trap. And then Part of Your World. So I'm going to write this down. Then I'm going to look at the average ratings. Then I'm going to redo it. And then I'm going to let you know what it turns out the results are, so we can see how wrong I am. I did have to do some rearranging, but I would say my guesses were pretty decent this go around. I'm going to start at the bottom and then work our way up to the top. So at the bottom, I did guess this one correct. You Again came in at 3.57, and then I had guessed that the Princess Trap would be above that, and I was correct about that guess as well. The average rating for that one would be 3.69. From there, in third to last place, so now we're kind of getting more so in the middle, we have One Last Stop at 3.91. I would say a lot of the rest of these are definitely leaning into users, generally speaking, seem to quite like these ones. 3.91 is obviously the next lowest, and 3.91 is a pretty good average rating. So that one would be going above. You just have to imagine that the Princess Trap is between these two. From there, we have the Rom-Commers. This one came in, I was actually kind of surprised at the average rating for this one. Not so much its placement, but the average rating for the Rom-Commers was 4.10. So perhaps a lot of other people really resonated with the elements that I resonated with as well, and that was the thing that a lot of people connect to, or maybe people just really love the love story. I don't know. When I do these, I try not to look at anybody else's thoughts ahead of time and just kind of go in not knowing anything. So the Rom-Commers, as I said, that one would be above One Last Stop. Then from there, we have The 7-Year Slip. The average rating for this one is very high. It's 4.19. My guess is that the grief components also really, really resonated with a lot of people. I would imagine a lot of people were really moved by those. And then although I kept saying I wasn't all that invested in the love story, I wasn't mad about the love story either. I liked both of the characters and I liked them together. I just felt like we were kind of going through their love story and fast forward, and it wasn't the thing that I was as invested in, but I still think a lot of people probably quite liked their relationship as well. So not too surprising, honestly, now that I've seen its placement, I'm like, yeah, that actually does make sense. And then in second place, we have The Stationery Shop. So the thing I thought might happen, where I was even saying like, I mean, I think Stationery Shop is the best, but I also just kind of feel like it's not quite, I don't know, maybe Part of Your World's higher. That is in fact what happens. The Stationery Shop had 4.22, and then at the top we have Abby Jimenez, Part of Your World, at 4.28. So even though there's some books missing, this was the general idea with The Princess Trap here, 7-Year Slip here, and then The Stationery Shop also here. So they're kind of squished between. And I think that average rating, that checks out. And also it was kind of in a weird way sort of validating to me as somebody who I feel like I'm on the outside looking in at this particular genre. I was so often in talking about my thoughts also trying to assess how I feel this fits in with what people are looking for when they go to this genre. And I actually feel like this average rating checks out in that way pretty well. So yeah, I think that made sense. There wasn't anything I was too shocked by necessarily, but that concludes our A Fantasy Fan Reads Contemporary Romance based off of the things that worked for me. What are some other books that you would recommend? I definitely am going to check out, I think the full title is The Lion Women of Tehran, by the author who wrote The Stationery Shop. I have already gotten a copy and I just am waiting for it to come in because I thought The Stationery Shop was so outstanding and I'm like, what else has this author written? So I'm definitely going to be checking that out. I'll check out more Abby Jimenez, and I'm going to see what else these authors have written and see if there's other things that look like they're my cup of tea. And then also for the ones that didn't necessarily work for me, if you actually liked those ones and you want to let people who also like those ones know, hey, even though they didn't work for Elle, here are some recommendations for books that if you liked those ones, you might like these too. Feel free to leave your recommendations for any of those readers. Thanks so much, though, as always, for watching. I really had a lot of fun with this. It was great to kind of dip my toes in and experience this genre a little bit more. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.